Thank you for that. Am I getting an echo?
Yeah, Brett, we're gonna have to mute one or the other.
Which one? Oh, this one's supposed to be muted. Oh no, that one's supposed to be on. This one's muted, sorry.
Brett, we're still having audio issues. Do you go ahead and unmute on the iPad you're on right now, not the computer. I
got it. Here we go.
There we go.
There we go.
Great.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that beautiful intro, and welcome everybody to this discussion and dialogue. We're very happy to have everybody here come through and wind up bridge building, and I can't wait to get into it. And I would like to introduce and welcome a good friend, colleague, and a well-respected activist here in the Valley and all around, the president and dean of Valley Beit Midrash, I hope I said that right, home of Arizona Jews for Justice, the Rabbi Dr. Shmuley Yankowitz. I'm really proud to be able to be here with him at the Arizona Jews for Justice as tomorrow we vote and get into the discussion, and we welcome everybody here.
Thank you so much. So friends, what we want to do together before we launch in is to create a little agreement together, and a little bit of a container for how we can do our work together. And there's really three parts to that Brent and I are going to lead us through. One, what are some of the goals we want to achieve here when we come together? Second, what are some of the values we want to uphold in that process? And third, what are some logistical agreements we want to share? So Brent, do you want to share any goals or values to kind of uphold in our container? Ellie's going to type and she's going to share what we generate together.
Absolutely. The goal that I had set was to create an understanding between both cultures where a respected commonality is obtained and a clear definition of what's right and wrong is addressed without malintent, and to be as honest as possible. With that open dialogue, I believe that we'll be able to cut through some of the hard spots, be able to tackle them directly, and have a much well-respected dialogue between the two, and hopefully come to some conclusions and solutions.
That was so articulate. I don't know if it's easy for you to chat, to copy and paste, or to write a few of those notes into the chat. It was so packed. It was so packed with helpful guidelines. So I want to share a few, and then we're going to open up the floor for others to weigh in a little bit. And some of these things, friends, that we share are probably obvious, but I think it's helpful to share just to be on the same page. The first thing is to say that no Black person represents all Black people. That ought to be obvious, right? That each of us is an individual. It's also that no Jewish person represents all Jewish people. Another kind of guideline I would think of is that there's intersectionality too. There's overlap, right? Mm-hmm. That Black folks can come from various religions and cultures. Jewish folks can be white, can be Black, can be Mexican. They're Jews of color. And so there are other folks here also that wouldn't identify as Black or wouldn't identify as Jewish. And so it truly is a diverse space. Okay, so let me, there's a lot more I want to say. Thanks for posting that, Brent. Does anyone else want to share either a goal or a value that you think we should bring to this space?
Reminder, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can type in the chat. It looks like we have a hand raised. So if you raise your hand, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Rabbi Shmuley, I'm going to describe this in two different ways. What you described as listening is the epitome of compassionate listening. And I'll put the link in there, the Compassionate Listening Project. This requires formal training. This is a type of listening which is quite different from any other than the others. In the Buddhist community, it's called compassion. And what you're asking for, you and Brent and hopefully, and maybe others here, in the radical left community, of which I am also a member, we describe it as united front work. The United Front means that I'm an officer in the Peace and Freedom Party, and I work with people who are members of the Democratic Party, Green Party, Republican Party, on specific issues that we agree with, such as democracy. I wonder if you have any thoughts about this, Rabbi Shmuley or Brent.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Brent, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I mean, it was called compassionate listening. I mean, I can't go off on everything else you had said, or trainings. But I mean, if it's what it sounds like, listening with compassion, listening with your heart, I absolutely agree with that. I think that people should have an open mind to what other cultures are presenting or who they are, so that nobody winds up getting erased. So compassionate listening in that sense, I wholeheartedly agree. I'm not sure how the training would be for that. I think for some people, it's to undo a lifetime of discrimination or hatred or whatever it is they have towards others, indifference. So if we can do that through people, starting with the open mind, I'm all for it. As long as you are listening and not just hearing, but then listening with compassion, I'm all for it.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, Yochanan. Thank you, Brent. Yeah, I agree with everything here. And just understand how difficult this is and how gentle we're going to be with each other to truly listen in such a way that we don't enter this space as educators to try to convince others or teach others, but rather to listen and to share using I language as much as possible. That we don't want to compare our different levels of trauma or different types of suffering or oppression, of who has a greater injustice of this or that, but rather just to build bridges and understanding. And I want to put a phrase out there. I'm going to put it in the chat also, even though it's, which I think about all the time for space like this, and I call it productive discomfort. Productive discomfort, which is to say, it's okay for this to not feel comfortable. Dialogue is not always supposed to feel comfortable, because we're receiving things and listening, and it's not so uncomfortable that we shut down or have to attack or defend, but it is uncomfortable enough that it's productively challenged me to think more deeply. Okay, someone else?
Hi. I always think like something like this, it's great. I think it's a little like we're all, I think, have the same goal. It's, if you will, preaching to the choir in a way. Like, how do we reach the people that aren't on here, that don't think that we should all be together and live, like, how do we reach those folks? Us, we're here, we could have the uncomfortable conversation and be fine, but I think you understand where I'm
amazing. Sabina, thank you. Brent, do you want to take a first stab, or you want me to?
You take the first stab and I'll come after you.
Okay, Sabina, thank you for that. And I think I would say two things to that. Firstly, I would say the project of making someone totally racist, not racist, or somebody totally anti-Semitic, not anti-Semitic, is a very different project. And so this is more about bridge building and collaboration with the ends of doing justice work in the world, for fostering justice in the world, and dialogue being a part of that process. And that just as we need to combat hate in the world, we also need to strengthen the bridges that enable deeper justice work to happen. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that all of us have biases and stereotypes and different degrees of incorrect information. And so I try to think of this not as like there's the haters over there and then the lovers over here, and putting ourselves in a lover's camp, but rather like this is all kind of messy. And the Baal Shem Tov, a Jewish teacher from hundreds of years ago, taught how the things we hate the most in the world ought to challenge us to uproot them more deeply from ourselves, which is to say that, I doubt somebody's going to join this who is truly a person filled with hate and looking to spew hate, but that each of us still has our work to do to uproot biases in us.
And I'd like to add on to that I love that you said it, which is true, that everybody's going to have a bias. Everybody has one. They don't want to recognize it, then that's even more of a problem, but everybody does have a bias. And it's something that they have to internally work on themselves, or hopefully ask questions and ask the hard questions to somebody else who's different from them in order to overcome that. If we can wind up doing that, then I think that the unification of just even both groups or all groups winds up outweighing those who are the haters. So if they wind up seeing a unification between two people or two cultures that they possibly don't like themselves, they're going to be, they can either get more irate about it or whatever, but sometimes you can't help everybody, but you can just unify with the ones that you want to unify with. And then we just hope that maybe generationally, things will wind up getting a little bit better, but it starts with that unification, and it always starts with one.
Mhm. Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you.
Nice. Thank you, Sabina. Thanks. Someone else? What feels important to you for this space? A value you want to see upheld, or a goal that you think we should work to achieve?
And bring up anything. Yeah, I mean, I would say even to open it up to anything. I mean, if there is something that someone is wanting to address, bring it up and maybe we can discuss it, as long as it is about positivity and building up.
Perfect. In the chat, we have a comment from Linda and Bob that said, step up, step back, be willing to contribute and listen more.
Right.
Absolutely. Exactly. Again, it starts with one. If we sit there and we wait for others to do the hard work, then you're going to wait forever. So sometimes it does take just that one to step up. And then you may have other people who wind up following your lead. So I do like that. Thanks, Linda and Bob, for that.
Anyone else want to jump in here before we move forward? This is very hard because on the one hand, we're asking folks to be bold and raise big questions and share personal narratives. On the other hand, we're asking folks to exercise great caution because we know how easy it is to alienate or hurt others. And so how to both kind of balance these two, is not always obvious, but we're going to be gentle with each other. So.
Perfect. So if anybody else is okay, we have unanimous consent to go on from our goals and intentions. Ellie's going to go ahead. I think she already posted them. If anybody else is okay with us going forth. Okay, Bob, yes.
I think what happens often is almost unavoidable is the issue of comparisons. The worst being comparing enslavement with the Holocaust. I had the privilege of hearing Reverend Irene Monroe, who some of you hopefully know. She's a wonderful speaker, and she was part of our multiracial Jewish network conference once. And she talked about how essential it was to never make comparisons of this sort, because people inevitably listening in pick the reason not to be empathetic for either. And she said, evils exist on different planes. Sometimes they intersect and sometimes they didn't. And the issue is to identify the evil in itself and recognize that comparisons are extraordinarily harmful. So the question is, how do you divert a comparison when the comparisons begin, whatever the issues might be of whatever competing malfeasance done to whatever group of people?
Thank you. Yeah, Ilana says she calls that oppression Olympics.
Yeah, and it's funny because that's what I had brought up when we were having this discussion, that we didn't want to talk about oppression Olympics, who had it worse, this or that. Each group winds up having something bad over history of time. In my history, in my own personal history, being the son of slaves and knowing sons of slaves and knowing that 250 plus year history of enslavement, you wind up in 2021, 2020, 2021, thinking about that all the time, because it's not necessarily, even though it is, what happened during that oppressive, very oppressive, because those years, but it's what happened afterwards. It's what happened afterwards. And I think that's what some of the things that we have to follow up on where it's not necessarily, hey, Holocaust versus slavery, because atrocities are atrocities, but it's what happened afterwards. How were things built up? How did people handle things built up? What did people do with the oppressed people during those times in order to build themselves up? And I think that's what's more important as into the buildup of both communities coming together and addressing that issue. That's where the hard work really comes. It's not so much, hey, you know what, who had it worse in the 20th century or, you know, these other centuries before, but what happened afterwards and how was that unification worked in together for each community? Did it happen? Did it not happen? And if so, that's what we would also have to address in order to come to a final unification between the two. Because if you don't address the past, because it's important that if you don't address the past or speak about it, then it's just going to continue. And a lot of times, you know, in my circles, you get told, oh, you're playing the race card. And, you know, when you get that monkey on your back, then it's like, okay, this is just gonna have to go on for another generation until somebody is allowed to speak about it.
Thank you. I would love to start off the dialogue with something a little bit more controversial.
Let's
How
do
do
it.
we address conversations when something is blatantly racist and when something is blatantly anti-Semitic, which both communities can fall very easily into? And I would love to start off with a response from Brent and then a response from Rabbi Shmuley. And then from there, we're actually gonna open up the room into having a little bit of a dialogue. We will be able to go into a deeper dialogue in smaller breakout rooms closer to the end. So again, let's go ahead and start off with that.
Okay, so you're speaking on something that's just blatantly racist. How do you handle it?
Correct. The question is,
Okay.
how do you approach a conversation
Okay.
when something blatantly racist comes out of your community, or when something blatantly anti-Semitic comes out of your
Okay,
community?
got you. I think and like Rabbi had said, you know, to speak from the I. To me personally, I come from New Jersey. My parents raised me very well, and they raised me in a really nice community. That was, believe it or not, very more or less multiracial and multi-ethnic for the most part. I mean, for what it was in the 70s and the 80s. But I grew up with a lot of Jewish friends. So I got to understand when I was younger, dreidels, especially when, you know, Hanukkah started coming around, you know, Hanukkah, and, you know, my school would teach about it. The kids would come in with the coins and, you know, we would be able to ask, what is that? And how does it relate? Because we always grew up with Santa and things like that. And the kids would be open to talk about that and spin the dreidels for us. And I'm a really big fan of culture, like food, culture, different places, visiting, talking to people, languages. And when somebody does wind up coming up and talking about something that's blatantly something within the community that, let's say, is anti-Semitic or speaking ill about another culture, it's best if you just stop them there and ask them what they do know about that culture. Like, what is it they know? Because if you ever speak to people who think they know something, they usually don't. And it's based on a stereotype. And if you can clear up that stereotype with people, then that's really good. If they wind up continuing on with that stereotype or that trope or whatever it is they want to discuss, because in their mind, that is what the truth is. And let's face it, we've gone through 4 years of that recently. Then sometimes it's best to just leave them alone, because you're not going to be able to win over everybody. And basically you don't want to. It's like if you are able to convince people to at least do the research or at least look into or even expand their own personal circles. One thing I like to do is tell people to look at their phone, look at like the last 10 people they've called. If the last 10 people you called don't look like you, then you're cool. But if they all look like you, then you probably have an issue around the people that you hang with, and you probably have a bias towards people. So in my opinion, you can't save everybody, but if you just hit it head on with knowledge, facts, and examples, they just might be able to do a little bit of research to find out that in their life they are wrong.
Amazing. That was very helpful, Brent. Thank you for that. And
Thank you.
so much to say here, but just briefly, I mean, the context obviously matters a lot to me. And I would kind of have a four-pronged approach. One would be what we call in Hebrew shalom, peace. Like, how do I foster peace in this moment in a certain context? Another would be dialogue, like when there's a space for dialogue. Another would be rebuke, like when someone has to kind of be put in their place in kind of some constructive way. And another would be protest, when it's kind of a matter of public protest. And the publicly challenging is the most complex. And I'm not even going to address social media, because social media is such a hot mess today around how people talk about people and about issues. But just in the context today around how to respond and what the context is, and to be the kind of person that people wouldn't feel safe sharing their bigotry around. That like, oh, you're like me, so I can share my bigotries around some other group. But to realize that that's not what we call the safe space. That's actually that we can call them in. We can call them in for deeper conversation. But the last thing I'll say here is that the racism or anti-Semitism, I think, applies to the entirety of that group, even though the boundaries are so ambiguous at times, right? Some people will be like, oh, I'm fine with Jews, like my Jewish friend, or a Jew who's politically like me, but those Hasidic Jews, like those ones are the worst, or those Republican Jews, they're horrible, whatever the case is. Or a white person is like, oh yeah, I've got a black friend and he's great, my black neighbor's fine, but those gangster black folks, like those black folks who are like out there with guns, most of those folks, like those ones, they have a big problem. As if to say, like, there's some minority of that group that I'm cool with, and some other minority or majority of that group that actually there's a problem with, to demonstrate they're not anti-Semitic and racist, to kind of hedge their bets that actually they're not a hater. And I think we have to show that, like, actually the entirety of the group, like the understanding of racism or discrimination or anti-Semitism, like, applies to the entirety of a group, and juggling how that we don't just like the ones who are like us. And so those are hard conversations to have.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I just really want to make sure that we address the chat. So Roberta said, and the suggestion that the group or person needs to claim the worst thing to happen to them is a tool of white supremacy. Pitting groups against each other is a way to distract them from finding commonalities and coming together. And Leslie said, agreed, Roberta. I'm very curious as to how the Jewish investment in our history can be used to talk honestly about how Jews may have created oppression, even if they didn't mean to. And it looks like we have one hand raised up. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes. Rabbi Shmuley, I agree with you how difficult it is for us to relate with compassionate listening. I'm very grateful for my having done this. So I'll give all of you an example of this. You say that it's difficult. The more experience we have, the more effortless it becomes. I stopped for gasoline. This is a true story. The gas station attendant stood next to me and vilified public school teachers. And we're crybabies, we're greedy for money. And I responded with, again, this is compassionate listening, the deep level, telling him that he deserves good paid benefits and working conditions as a gas station attendant, and why. He again negatively stereotyped public school teachers. I again told him what I just said. Then he told me he hadn't gotten a raise in 3 years. I've had jobs like that, minimum wage, where we are at the lowest level of the company. I didn't tell him that I'd been a public school teacher for 30 years, Rabbi Shmuley. It is addressing compassionate listening, addressing his deep needs, his need to feel respected, his need to feel cared about. And I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about this.
I'm gonna go, Johan. That's a great process to bring up in the breakout rooms. I really want us to focus on the question and its health, and I also want to open up the room for our Black voices to be able to speak out and be able to have some airtime as well. I want to also acknowledge what my friend Roberta was talking about, for us to be conscious about Jewish Disability Awareness Month, to take away from step up, step back, to referring it more to share the air. So I want to make sure we share the space, and we can also elevate Black voices to be able to feel a part of the contribution of the program. So Johan, we will make sure that we address your conversation in the breakout rooms. Remember, again, the question was, how do we act or react when there is either racism in our community or anti-Semitism coming out from our own community?
Anybody want to speak up?
Leslie, would you like to read your answer here in the chat?
So I think anti-Semitism and racism are often due to ignorance and or misguided assumptions can be found across our political spectrum, is what I put, and it was in response to another comment. And I guess what I would say is that I think that what I struggle with is that sometimes we have people who run in to solve problems that don't need to be solved, like, one thing I struggle with is I have a lot of white Jewish friends who want to help the Black community, but then don't realize that they're being patronizing, or that they're, kind of stepping in spaces they don't need to be stepping. They start making assumptions around help or this or that may not always be experienced the way it was intended. And so sometimes I think that oftentimes creates difficulties in our conversation as well, because you can be well-intentioned and still engage in behaviors that can be discriminatory or might even potentially be offensive, even if they weren't intended that way. And so trying to help differentiate those things, I think, is sometimes hard. But I think that it shows up from across, across the spectrum. We definitely have anti-Semitism and racism.
Can I address it? I have gotten that where it's almost a lack of an education as into what the needs of the people are, and where someone will use their own personal, I guess their own personal theories or ideas as into how they believe that should be tackled because it worked for their group. And when you're a specialized group with specialized needs, you have to be handled by the way that they want to do it. So when you wind up in that space where, let's say it's Black Lives Matter, it's like we're protesting for something, or even if you're Colin Kaepernick and, you see him kneeling and it's like, hey, you know what? He's kneeling and he's protesting in his own way. You wind up saying people who may be well-intentioned, but they're like, you know what? You shouldn't protest like that. Protest like this because it's going to be more effective. That's when you wind up erasing that other person's identity, and it does become harmful. And that is a community thing that should be addressed. So I understand what you're saying about stepping on the toes of others, although well-intentioned. That's where that listening comes into play. It's like, listen to what people say. Sometimes you have to quiet your mouth and then listen to what they need. When they ask for your help, they'll need it then, but then just make sure that you walk in the way that they would like for you to walk instead of putting yourself into their shoes.
Thank you so much. Again, I want to encourage some of our Black friends to share thoughts and feelings, comments, either on the chat or unmute yourself, as we want to make sure we elevate those voices as well. Again, the question is, how do we react when there's either racism or anti-Semitism coming from our own community? In the efforts to continue our conversation here, I'm going to go ahead and move us along into the dialogue of our questions here. So oftentimes our communities are isolated from each other. What is the best way to bridge communities together? oftentimes what we see is that the Jewish community stays to itself. And for the most time, we have seen that Black communities have not engaged with Jewish communities. What it would be the best approach to bridge build communities together? So the question is in the chat as well, if you all want to see it. And anybody who wants to answer, go ahead and just unmute yourself and feel free, or type and I will read it for you.
This is Leslie. So I'm in Atlanta, and one of the areas that we try to do outreach is through social justice work, or coalitions and working towards common goals that groups have. And then the other area where I find a lot of connection is in celebration and food and singing, like things that we can all enjoy together. Just as as people, and getting to know each other. So I think that when it comes to building relationships, you don't always have to start with hard stuff, that maybe you start getting to know people as people, and then growing those relationships to move into other ways of relating.
Thank you for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and read the chat. Rabbi Shmuley said, I love the power of service work, service/volunteering together. Definitely. Thank you, Rabbi.
Let's go back to food. I don't know if there's anything common within soul food or Jewish meals, but I do know when I was in Brooklyn, I had never before celebrated Hanukkah before, and my landlords were Jewish. And one day, it was during Hanukkah season, they had asked me to come up and, celebrate with them. And the food was so good. It was just really good.
I'm sorry, I'm hearing two conversations.
Oh, do you? You have
Sounds okay over here.
Yeah. Yochanan, I think that might be your audio. It sounds perfect on our end as well here.
Yes.
It's Brent Whiting's not muted.
I'm the one who's speaking. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Brent, we're good.
You sound good, Brent.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna just keep going. So, I had a really good time, and it was almost like a celebration just between food and over food, with these different cultures coming together. And I think that a lot of things have actually been done, just like in business. A lot of people go golfing together and they wind up solving things over golfing. Things can also be done over food and just different cultures of food. And I've seen it happen in various reasons, various regions, going over my sister who was on there. Hey, Kelly, how you doing? I see you. My sister and I have traveled Europe together, God, a few times. And even though we aren't familiar with, let's say, French culture per se, or, some of these other cultures, Scandinavian cultures, we would go up there, eat, or Italian, and just eat food and just have a really good time eating what the people ate. And believe it or not, you can wind up just getting such a great understanding, just like I did at that Hanukkah meal, of more of the people through food. And if you've ever gone to a Black cookout or whatever, you wind up getting more of a sense of the people through food as well. And believe it or not, my wife, who loves watching Netflix food stories and documentaries, loves to see all the foods that people just make. And it is just an idea for people to come together, even just culturally, but just also just consume the meals of the people that has been, been made and replicated for generations. So even that's a great idea, in order for people to just come together, speak about whatever it is over foods and meal. And I think that that's one of the unification things that is kind of almost lost, in the sense that we don't do it on purpose. And I think that's one of the things that after COVID is done, we should do together.
I don't think anybody and any of our team would say no to joining in with some food. One of the things I've noticed is for almost every Jewish holiday, there's almost food attached to it. So for Purim coming up, I'm gonna make sure that we get some hamintashins. And Brent, I promise you, I'll get you some, brother. So to keep us moving along, oh, sorry, Sabina, you had your hand up.
I
I'm
just
so
want to
sorry.
show
Go
you a
ahead.
book that I have, and actually I haven't read it in a while. And I really would have to reread it because it's not only recipes, it's storytelling as to what, what take I would have on it, being a little more enlightened. But it is interesting, and it does kind of meld cultures and recipes. So, but I'm going to have to reread some of the stories.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. The next question to continue our dialogue is, when does allyship kind of create more struggle than it does progression? When does allyship create more struggle rather than progression?
Good one. And I think it's kind of what Leslie said. It's the progress is always to move forward. It's to move forward. And I got to give a shout out to the last election to Black women who have saved this democracy many times. But I think that a lot of times, since that I'm within the voting area, it winds up being where progress, you think that you would wind up voting for people who want to also be progressive. And I personally, will always follow within the roots of my people who always want to progress from where we were to go to a place where there's way more equality, where there is a lot of equity, where we will be able to catch up to the things that we have been denied for so long, and we will vote in favor of that. And when you have those who are also in the struggle who don't do that, they vote for their own self-interests or the interests of their groups instead of for the interests of others who need to excel, who aren't where they are and need to excel. I think that's when progress winds up being backpedaled by everybody, because if the lowest, those who wind up struggling the most, can't succeed, then really nobody can actually move forward. So I think that that's one of the one of the reasons, or examples, I should say, of when progress, although well-intentioned, doesn't happen between two people.
Part of what progress implies is that, or I guess inherent to the meeting, is that we're moving forward. And sometimes we want to move forward so fast, and yet allyship means slowing down. Progress is moving forward, and allyship means slowing down. It means going through a process of listening, of partnering, of being in relationship. And a lot of people, they just want to run. Give us our victories now. We want to win this election. We want to win this campaign. Like, we want to do a rally in 10 minutes. And I think that progress has to slow down through allyship, and because it's hard work to be allies to lots of different types of people, and to listen and to process and to work together, truly collaborate rather than just throwing different logos on a flyer, to truly work together. And that's can be really challenging. And allyship can also alienate. I think of, I hold nothing against those who pray through the name of Jesus Christ as their savior. But when it's done at collective prayer, I feel deeply alienated. When people pray in the name of Jesus at a collective prayer experience, given Jewish history, I find that very difficult. And I think with deeper allyship, people would understand how a prayer space, which is supposed to be about allyship, praying for justice, praying for solidarity, can actually marginalize.
And Eddie, this is Leslie again. I'd also say that I think one struggle I see is sometimes, at least in today's world, the issue of kind of identity politics and how sometimes they run into each other. And that when different groups assume certain things about other groups in terms of those identities. For an example, I do a lot of work in the criminal justice space. And so when I've been talking to some of my colleagues who are Black, they'll say, oh, well, we see Jews as being white, right? Which most of us are white in terms of certainly white privilege in this country. But at the same time, within my own community, there's a lot of Jews that would not necessarily immediately agree with that statement. And they see their Jewishness as being different than just other white people in the country, right? So sometimes I see those identities kind of bumping up against each other in terms of the assumption people make when they're trying to be an allyship and coalition. And they're not necessarily conscientious or purposeful issues, but I think that's where you talk about that developing the relationship becomes really important, because we need to understand and be willing to walk through some of those difficult and sometimes inadvertent mistakes that we make and recognize that we're trying to be genuine in having those connections, but sometimes we're going to screw up in terms of that.
In fact, piggyback. I mean, it's funny. I had my mouth open, and Leslie had almost said what I was going to say. In the Black community, we don't know the difference necessarily, and I can speak for myself, but I've also had this conversation with people between white Jews and others who are Jewish. Because when we wind up in America, wind up talking to someone who's Jewish, we see a white person, and in that space, and it's funny because I had a conversation with a woman on a Jewish blog about maybe 6 months ago, and someone had posted, "Aren't Jews white?" And she said, "No, they're not." And it wound up being a big conversation that Jews are not white; they are not white people. And other people were speaking from the concept of how we are here in America, where we only necessarily, you may see a few of, obviously Eddie's right in front of me, but for the majority, that it's of the people who are mostly white. And throughout history, will wind up, especially now and today, but throughout history, will benefit from white privilege. And in the Black community, when we wind up seeing someone benefiting from from white privilege, if they wind up they wind up wanting to join our cause, we might have take pause in that, in the sense that we know that they're not going to exactly experience what we are experiencing, because we can't run away from our color in that sense. And even though, let's say, the Ku Klux Klan was after both of us, if somebody doesn't want to say that they are Jewish and they have white skin, they might be able to get a pass, whereas a Black person may not. So just to piggyback off of Leslie, that's where some of the distrust may wind up being in that sense. Anybody else want to back me up? Who's on? Anybody else want to speak?
Well, this is Kelly. I'm Brent's sister, and I've just been sitting because I for a number of reasons, I've gone through so many different thoughts as I've sat here. Conversations like these are so difficult for so many reasons. Number one, because my truth isn't your truth and your truth isn't my truth. And if I share my truth and I'm told, I've been in conversations where I have been sharing my truth, and already you could see the wheels spinning in other people's, like, to either say why my truth isn't right, or, it's not the way that they see. And so when that happens, over time, you tend to hold back, right? You want to sort of get a feel of the room and what's going on, and who's willing to say what and how far are people willing to go. And so it's like you can either go left or you can go right, or you can kind of stay on the straight and narrow, not really offend people. Because even the most best meaning words and actions still have the ability to offend, especially if someone is open to the offense. Even if there's an assumption that what you're saying, like if there's a way to interpret it one way or the other, sometimes people are very quick to assume that you are being negative when you aren't. And I've just been going over some of the experiences, sitting here. Am I going to share these experiences or not? Because I certainly wouldn't share them with a goal of saying, so therefore a group of people are like this. Like, these are some of my shared experiences. And so I hope that with some of the things that I say, that you understand, that the sincerity in which it's approached. I went to school, so I went to an Ivy League. I went to Yale. So at Yale, I was introduced to a lot of different cultures. I had a lot of different friends, and I don't want to be that person that said, "Oh, my best friends were," but literally, I mean, I did have a lot of friends, and so I will always cherish that. One of the earliest memories I have is in freshman year. There was a young Jewish man, and then like two of my friends are Asian, and so we were talking, we're talking politics and stuff. And my two Asian friends were both Chinese. We were talking about the word Oriental, and they were talking about, oh my God, I hate Oriental. And so his name was Rich. Rich was like, well, why? Like, that doesn't bother me. right? So immediately, like the context was, but why is that a bad word? I don't see what's wrong with it. It doesn't bother me. And meanwhile, there are two Asian women saying why it bothered them. In our dining hall, we would, so it probably happens in a lot of spaces, but you do tend to congregate among people that you are most comfortable with, right? So in the dining hall, if there are 30 tables, there would be an African-American table, and then there would be like 29 other tables. And I can't tell you how many times people came up to us and say, well, why do you all sit together? And so I looked and I was like, you see this one table, there are 29 other tables that are basically all white. You don't see the other 29, you just see the one. So experiences like that, and then I went to law school. So I went to University of Michigan Law School. And to be there during, I don't know if you all recall, like there were cases like Hopwood and, you know, where affirmative action was challenged. And I'm in the midst of it because not only was Michigan, the University of Michigan undergrad challenged, but also the law school at the time that I was there. So you can imagine the tensions and, you know, the different viewpoints. And I'll never forget, I was in my constitutional law class and my professor's trying to, you know, talk about affirmative action, but not really talk about affirmative action. And there was one young man who said, you know, the reason I'm against affirmative action is because it allows unqualified people to come in. Okay, I'm one of like 12 African Americans in this class of 300 people. There are legacies, there are all kinds of other people there. I come, you know, bringing my background from with, you know, my grades and everything, my experience. And meanwhile, this person is from, you know, he's a legacy and he comes from a school that has no grades. I guess my point, and I'm going to wrap up, I apologize. You know, it's just so much stuff going on. But my point is, I think once we get beyond seeing like, so being so insular and seeing outside and recognizing that there are differences in others that we need to understand from there. If a person is telling me that they don't like this word, it might seem harmless to me, but that's not for me to denigrate their position and tell them that they're wrong. And I just, you know, I feel that if we can get over that hump of, then that's where the real dialogue takes place. So I'm sorry, I'm finished.
Thank you for
Thanks,
sharing.
sis.
Thank you for sharing. Okay, Ilana, you wanted to share as well?
Yeah, I'm kind of jumping back in. I got a cancellation, so sorry if what I'm about to say is a little like off topic. But in the beginning of our call today, Brent, you said something that resonated with me, which is considering what happened after the Holocaust and slavery. And for me, being Black and Jewish, when I enter Jewish spaces, sometimes I can feel the subtle scrutiny or curiosity, or sometimes subtle, I guess you could say, privilege, because I do experience racism when I enter Jewish spaces. And then also when I enter Black spaces, sometimes I can feel like an outsider. You know, when I get asked to go to church, I'm like, oh, well, here's my time to come out and say that I'm Jewish and I don't go to church. I don't know those gospel songs or, you know, whatever else. So yeah. On both sides, usually unintentionally, I think this happens. But I had a conversation with my friend who's Black, and they mentioned something that was an anti-Semitic trope, as I often see in non-Jewish communities. I wouldn't say specifically the Black community does this. But it was that Jews basically came together and made money after the Holocaust, which is why they are rich and why the Jews are such a wonderful community now, which I think is a model myth, model minority myth, which is where Jews are the people who earned their money and crawled their way out of oppression, basically, into the current space that they are in. And Black people have something innately wrong with them because they weren't able to do that, which we know is not true. Sorry, my voice is shaking. I have anxiety. But the reality is, after slavery, I feel like Black folk never received reparations in the US of any, or really any form of equity. And I feel like the Jewish community, they rightfully received forms of reparation after the Holocaust, and even their own form of self-determination. Although most Jews actually do not make more income than anyone, Jews were provided some form of equity, which I think better equipped the Jewish community. But I think what's important, though, is to realize that Jewish folk and Black folk do not need to compare their struggles, but realize that both communities are battling against white supremacy, and that there's that's where we need to come together to fight the common enemy, even though we may have different aspirations in our community. So yeah.
Thank you so much, folks. I'm gonna really finish off strong here. I'm gonna put everybody in randomized groups for breakout rooms, and in the chat, I'm gonna go ahead and post it. My great friend Ellie here is gonna post. What are some practices of resiliency your community has done to maintain its communal support during the growth of racism / anti-Semitism across the US? So you're gonna see right now that you're gonna be asked to join a breakout room. We might go a little bit over, so we're gonna give you 4 minutes to share. We're gonna give you 4 minutes to share. The question is right there. Go ahead and click on your breakout room, and it's gonna be completely random, completely random. Go ahead and click on your breakout room. Hey, sorry, mine was taking a long time to load. How are you? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm glad we have a chance to finally meet. I feel like I've been exchanging emails with you, and then I've not even had a chance to like sit down and have a conversation with you. So,
awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. And tell me to shut up. I try to back off, but I just hate it when we sit there with dead air and I'm like, come on. So, you know.
Thank you. So what are your thoughts on resiliency? Because I think that that is a common trait within both of the Black community and the Jewish community. And for me as a JOC as well, being Mexican and being documented, it's also like
oh, wow.
something that really affects me, you know, and
yeah.
what comes to light is resiliency.
So I actually converted to Judaism. And and one of the reasons why I did was because of resiliency. I went to Dachau when I was 13, and I was just stunned at the evil that we can inflict on each other, and then, but also just really inspired by the resiliency of the Jewish people in response to that. I mean, not just the Jewish people, but you know, in particular, we were at that. And so I think I agree with you. I think there are a lot of common values in terms of, in part because of minority status, right? So resiliency, history, community, self-reliance, right? Kind of helping each other up when you're self-up by your bootstraps underneath, even within the construct of oppression. And in fact, I feel like there's some real room, even in our conservative spaces, to connect around some of those values. Do you know what I'm saying? That I think that I have a tendency to live in a more liberal space, but I also in Atlanta where half the Jews here are more conservative, and we're still looking to build some of those bridges. It's hard because people immediately go to Black Lives Matter, they immediately go to immigration issues, and it's like, wait a second, but we need to figure out how to connect as a community, as a Jewish community, so that we can then find those points of outreach where it fits, you know? And we do have a lot of Jews of color in our more traditional settings. And so, you know, that's one thing that I'm very interested in continuing to grow and to broaden that conversation, because people just get scared off. And I'm like, no, we have a lot in common that have to do with strengths and not just oppression, you know?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I think there's just like the work continues both internally and externally, right? Like, how do you address your own internal biases? How do you work to dismantle anti-Blackness within yourself? Like, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and go back, and then I'm going to bring us all the way back.
Well, let's you and I try to set up a time to talk. I'll send you an email.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. So I think, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcasting. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Eddie.
All righty, folks. I think folks are going to start trickling in back from their breakout room.
I returned to the main room because there was no one in room 5.
Oh, no. Okay, so we will try to see why that happened. Do you want to share, Johan, with Leslie? You're on mute, Johan.
If you want for a minute, I can listen.
While everybody comes back, please. Yes.
So what was the question that you were wanted to talk about? Resiliency?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Johan, I'm actually kind of interested in your perspective in regards to that.
What are some practices? Oh, yes, I'm actually planning to do that where I got my one of my degrees. Resilience involves 4 steps or 4 things. Number 1 is having a gratitude practice.
Mm-hmm.
For Orthodox Jews, it's every morning saying Moda Ani or Moda Ani, I give thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2 is a community you feel supported by.
Mm-hmm.
And each person can decide, is it a faith-based community, political, etc. Number 1, gratitude. Number 2, community. Number 3 is believing that what we do makes a difference. This is the social dynamic concept of critical mass. Every act of kindness makes a difference, including when we don't see it in our lives. At the personal level, it may not make a difference at the societal level. And Leslie, the example of this is what happened in the 1830s. A few white Americans supported abolition, not enough for there to be a law. Critical mass, 1860, 20%. By 1864, it was over 75%. We got the 13th Amendment. Number 4 is for each person to take manageable steps. If all you can do is drive by a rally and gently honk your horn to show support, that's what you do. If you can do more than that, then that's what you do. Related to that is have role models, people, your mentors. I wonder if any of you have any thoughts about this.
Thank you so much, Johan. We can continue our conversation for a longer time, as this conversation is definitely worthy of a longer period. Thus, we will have the opportunity to do so in the future. I want to thank every single one of you for coming on this call, for taking the journey with us, for taking the steps to really have a productive dialogue. I think it's important to address our own internal biases and address our own internal anti-Blackness and try to see how we can work on that. Address our own biases that we may have, addressing anti-Semitism, etc., to really work on that. So I appreciate every single one of you who joined us today. This call was recorded, so if anything from here interests you, please reach out to me on an email at eddie@utzedek.org. That's eddie@utzedek.org. And we will be happy to give you a copy of this recording. Thank you all for joining today. Have a phenomenal day. Part of the progressive movement is us working together collectively. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Hey, Eddie.
Leslie, I'll email you. Our time
Okay.
is yeah, I'll email you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Everyone.